All right, welcome everyone. Very glad that you are able to be here today. I appreciate everyone hopping on. And again, I'll continue to let people in the room as they arrive. But I wanted to quickly welcome everyone and then hand this over to Dr. Mattarock, who is going to give us some interesting information today. And while he is speaking, I'm going to go ahead and get those slides shared for everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Amanda. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. As Amanda said, my name's Mike Mattarock. I serve as an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the Institute for Information Networking, where we work a lot of graduate students across the artificial intelligence and cybersecurity domains, and a number of programs really focusing on how we can continue to evolve the discipline of artificial intelligence engineering forward, and focus on some of the different security tenants when we think about robust and resilient systems that we want to continue to build. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time supporting national security across a variety of organizations, very much trying to bring technology alive for the warfighter and looking at how we can modernize mission capabilities. So I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you today. I think we have somewhat interesting information that we can dive into as we start thinking about how to translate cyber threat intelligence into active risk modeling, and really do a good job of that in terms of informing our decision making across different mission spaces, as well as really thinking about how we should translate data that we have from raw form into actionable courses of action that we can use among leaders, among other stakeholders in different organizations like that. So very excited to speak with all of you today. We have some slides to run through here just to help guide our conversation, but also happy to engage in questions that you might have and other kinds of discussion points. Surely, I don't need to pontificate by any stretch of the imagination, so we can have a good discussion for the next hour. So in our discussion, in the world today, and right now we have many different channels to obtain threat intelligence, but we typically see across organizations a large struggle to really take action information that's contained. So on the next slide, Amanda, if we hop into our briefing here, we can kind of jump into starting to have that conversation where we want to move our focus. Next slide, please. And I'm not sure, it doesn't look like the slides are moving.
Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and stop sharing and I will reshare just one moment. Technology.
Yeah, always the fun of technology, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that, I guess, here too, when we think about integration and what happens, particularly in the organizational change model, as we try to facilitate good adoption if we don't have consistency. That's one of the struggles we continue to see right now. We'll hit on it a little bit with uncertainty quantification and our ability to really assess the outputs that are coming from different systems. But I would argue, that's really one of the most important tenets right now of artificial intelligence. We jump into this area of just wanting to kind of implement the latest and greatest kind of sexy solutions without really doing our due diligence about thinking about security and understanding the confidence levels when we think about the outputs coming from models and algorithms. So it looks like we're back in business now. So just on the next slide, as we kind of have our conversation here around the introduction and think about some of the different aspects related to threat intelligence and threat assessment and threat modeling, all these different terminologies, sometimes a little bit tricky to kind of keep track of as they're all thrown to you. I want to really center our conversation today to talk about something that all organizations and agencies really struggle with. And that's not getting threat intelligence, but rather doing something meaningful with it. So, our focus will be, on this punchline of how do we move from threat awareness to measurable cyber risk decisions? And in particular, how do we integrate qualitative and quantitative threat intelligence into more formal risk models that are actually actionable, part of our operation, that are able to support forecasting, investment prioritization, and really operational response, and especially in the R cyber context. So we have some use cases here I wanted to kind of include as we explore these concepts that are of most relevance to R cyber. So you can see here on the slide, the problem that we really have right now isn't visibility. It's really translation. There's plenty of different reports that are out there, really thinking about, what is concerning, but that's really where they stop. Commanders and leaders especially need answers to different questions when these kinds of reports and information come in related to things like, how much does this really matter to my organization? What should we be doing differently, perhaps? Are there courses of action we should take that are outside of our current strategy? And if we don't act or take any action, what risks are we accepting? And this translation gap, if you will, is what I really want to talk about today because it continues to be a major pain point across industries and across organizations, not necessarily unique to the government or national security, but really across a broad stretch of different organizations. So on the next slide, we'll kind of just hit on some of the objectives that'll help guide our conversation as we kind of work here together. So this first one really being around examining kind of our ability to assess qualitative and quantitative inputs. So looking at what they are, how they contribute differently to risk modeling. Then we'll discuss how to take action on identified threats, including how intelligence should actually change model assumptions and forecasts. So the actual doing behind that, if you will. Third on here, we'll build awareness of tools and methodologies. Again, we have limited time together, but I really want to touch on some of the more impactful tools and methodologies that are out there. So we'll talk about FAIR and MITRE ATT&CK, among others, and really talk about some of the other tools that support judgment, recognizing, and I think this is an important aspect, just with my experience in national security, tools don't replace our ability to make those decisions. They support that, they aid in it. And I think sometimes we personify these technologies a little bit too much and really give that kind of responsibility there when we shouldn't. Throughout, these kinds of tenets of our discussion, we'll tie the concepts back to our cyber use cases because the problem looks very different in a persistent engagement environment than it does in some aspects of the commercial world. And so I want to talk about that a little bit and just jump in there, especially given I think the majority of our participants are from Cyber Command and other aspects that support the stakeholders. As we begin, in this discussion, one other point I want to make reference to just from a rules of engagement. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat as we're going through here. I am going to do my best to make sure that I end the discussion early so that way we have plenty of time to answer your questions that pop up or dive into any other kind of considerations that you want to look at in this area. I'm excited to kind of facilitate that discussion. So without further ado, we'll kind of jump into our view. On the next slide here, I want to just kind of begin with some R cyber mission imperatives that I think will be instrumental in guiding our conversation as we really think about some of these different considerations that are different in national security, especially than they may be in the commercial world. So for instance, this idea that for our cyber, threat intelligence isn't academic, right? This is operational. And when we think about cybersecurity threat intelligence, it has to be able to protect mission critical networks and weapon systems. We want to make sure that we're able to facilitate good operational readiness and continuity of operations. Think about having a risk-informed force projection and really prioritizing our different cyber operations that we have across the board. And the key distinction here, and kind of highlighted a bit on the slide, is that our cyber operates under persistent engagement. And this is a consideration that is very important when we think about turning threat intelligence into risk modeling. There's no clean separation between peace and incident response, if you Once adversaries are already inside, they're already probing, already shaping, we have to deal with that situation abruptly. And a situation we hope, never happens, but we also have to make sure that we have good balance of offensive and defensive cyber considerations here to really make sure that we are prepared when that happens. So when we think about this, cyber risk models have to be able to be reflective of active adversaries, not just past data points that we have, right? And that can be pretty tricky when we take more of a proactive stance. We also want to make sure that our cyber risk models that are supporting this agency and others support commander decision making. That's what we're trying to get at to make these effective and to really facilitate user adoption. And then finally here, we want to enable defensive prioritization under uncertainty. That's becoming increasingly important as we have plethoras, in some instances, petabytes of data that are coming at us on a regular basis that we need to be able to distill and take action from. One other consideration here that I would offer, and this is true not just for our cyber, but for any organization, is the overall importance of aligning your cyber strategy with an organization's missions, goals, and objectives. And I know that might sound a little bit cliche. It pops up from time to time, but it really is of utmost importance. And something that we continue to look at to have effective adoption and implementation. Your cyber strategy cannot sit in isolation. It cannot be siloed from what your organization is trying to achieve. In fact, really has to be a big part of what that mission is. So when we think about mission goals and objectives and the criticality of what we're trying to represent, we want to make sure that our cybersecurity strategy is well aligned to that as well. So as we begin this discussion on the next slide of kind of looking at qualitative and quantitative input, I just kind of want a kind of form that you see here, and there's a lot of text slide that's just looking at some of the differences and examples that exist across qualitative inputs and quantitative inputs. And sometimes we get this question of which one's more important, and arguably that is a difficult question to answer because both are. And so if we start at the foundation with these inputs, cyber risk modeling relies on both fundamentally different types of intelligence. Here you can see examples of qualitative and quantitative. While they're not interchangeable, they do both work together in answering different questions. And both are required if you're going to have effective risk modeling take place that's building from your cyber threat intelligence. You can see here these different examples, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through them. These might be topics that you're already familiar with when we think about threat actor intent, and then understanding some of the frequency observed of attacks and other kinds of metrics and collection mechanisms that you want to have. One way to kind of help you guide are the boxes at the bottom of the slide. Qualitative intelligence is really essential for framing assumptions and shaping scenarios. And we're going to talk about how to craft some of those scenarios in just a bit. And this is true even in the absence of precise data, where our quantitative intelligence really allows us to increase model defensibility, but must be anchored to realistic assumptions derived from that qualitative insight. So the punchline here is just really focusing on the interoperability that we have between these two inputs and the importance that each really makes as we think about how these are put into action. On the next slide, we'll kind of jump into an exemplar, if you will, for our cyber about some qualitative inputs and then do the same for quantitative inputs in hopes that this kind of makes sense. That's why I kind of wanted to skip over the more conceptual ideas that were on the previous slide for here. So when we think about some of the different qualitative inputs that are relevant to our cyber, we want to try to think about intelligence that tells us what is happening and why. That's probably the best way to kind of frame this. So that includes thinking about things like threat actor intent and motivation, some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, targeting patterns and adversary objectives that exist across a wide range of different threat actors, and really thinking about some of the analyst's judgment and confidence. This intelligence, I'd say, really helps us understand context and meaning more than anything. And the key point, and another really key point here to take away, qualitative intelligence is essential, again, for framing those assumptions and shaping scenarios. And we can see that here with, if you consider this our cyber use case of pre-positioning in theater networks. So let's say that our feeds, our inputs that we're receiving here are telling us that nation-state actors conducting long-term access operations against logistics and mobility systems supporting Indo-PACOM. That is arguably one of the challenges that we have today. That resonates in a number of different agency responsibilities. And when we think about the qualitative risk questions that really stem from there, we want to immediately kind of analyze, does the actor that we have under consideration have intent to disrupt or only collect information, trying to understand what their objective is to be able to best respond and also prevent that kind of action from taking place. Also thinking about what phase of conflict does this activity align with when we map this back to other mapping, and other kind of models that we might use to be able to have effective responses. And then finally, this idea here of which mission functions would be most degraded if their access is activated. And what does that kind of look like when we start thinking about response? So as you can see here, one of the other examples within this use case is just that importance of making sure we have alignment between not just your cyber warriors, but also those that are most intimately connected to the mission. In this case, to be able to blend that expertise between those two stakeholder groups is really essential to do a good job here. And we'll continue to see that as we go throughout our discussion. So continuing on the next slide with some of the examples related to quantitative inputs, and just to kind of offer up this difference between the two. As previously alluded to, quantitative inputs answer a different question. These are typically data points that are going to help us understand how often and how much at a very basic level. You can think about things here like attack frequency, historical loss data, exploit rates, might be another. Also thinking about detection and response times. That's very important to understand the benchmark of your organization. How quickly can you identify that a breach has taken place, and also how quickly can you respond to that? Control effectiveness is another aspect here that is important for us to measure and continue to assess and have a consistent measure across organizations of that we're able to do so with quantitative inputs. And then estimated loss. Obviously, that's very important. We could be calculating anything from, equipment and other asset loss to potentially human loss. If we're not successful in being able to harden and secure the systems that we're talking about for this particular mission. So very important inputs here when we consider all of the different areas for us to really look at model defensibility. And that's really the aim of quantitative inputs. They should be, if they're used effectively, increasing model defensibility, but only when they're grounded in realistic assumptions. And again, those realistic assumptions largely stem from your operation. What is feasible? When you think about investments, when you think about decision making, and which direction rather your organization's going. This is true for most other kind of quantitative data analysis. Numbers without context are just as dangerous as intuition without structure, right? So if we have that taking place, it's really not helpful. Another use case just to kind of offer up here to make sure your brains are all kind of flowing in this area, again, somewhat unique to our cyber, we might have intel telling us that data is showing a delayed patching on systems that are supporting personnel and transportation management. Some of the risk inputs that we might want to have there is really assessing the probability of a successful exploitation given that delay, and also understanding time to recovery during surge operations and other mission delay costs that we might have. Could be measured in minutes, hours, days, different kind of durations there, depending on the situation and how significant that attack could be. On the next slide, we kind of begin our discussion here talking about bridging our qualitative and our quantitative intelligence together. And this is probably, in some ways, the most important slide that's in this deck, to be honest with you. Effective cyber risk modeling requires translation, not replacement. And that's very, very important here. That means that we're looking at taking and doing our due diligence of mapping threat narratives to modeled scenarios. Those modeled scenarios are going to be unique to our organization or our agency, converting expert judgment into probability ranges, and using qualitative CTI to adjust specific model parameters. And it's important here to just, have that kind of recall back to qualitative intelligence is answering those questions of what and why, while quantitative modeling is really helping us to answer how much it matters. So this bridge is where most programs either fail or mature, based off a lot of the research that we've done across Carnegie Mellon University and additional, studies that have been conducted, really looking at where the breakdown occurs in this pipeline of threat intelligence to cyber risk modeling. This tends to be the weakest link, if you will. And this is where we are able to see effective outcomes versus those that maybe lag. And this is, again, I would say the step where really you're taking action of the intelligence that you have available to you versus just sitting on potentially all of these different raw inputs that are likely coming from many different channels, government, industry, other sources that you're going to have that are trying to feed in this wider trend that's taking place across your cyber area. On the next slide, kind of jumping into another R cyber example where we are justifying risk increases. Here's the real challenge here, I would say. How would our cyber justify increased cyber risk ratings, let's say for logistics systems, when no major incident has yet occurred? And this is very challenging right now, right? This question isn't unique to our cyber either. For any of you that are in the commercial aviation space, this is one that keeps me up at night, if you will. We continue to see difficulty getting investment, particularly in commercial aviation right now, in the absence of any kind of major incident taking place. And unfortunately, as cyber warriors, we know that many times it is difficult to get leadership consensus and investment until such an event has occurred. And that's not what we want to have take place, particularly when we think about an agency like our cyber that's charged with promoting our national security and really playing a mission critical role in the overall national security of the United States and allies. The answer here is not fear, but rather structure. And so, I would say some of the potential levers that we can kind of pull here are really looking at intelligence-informed decision-making, increasing our likelihood of success, making sure that we have modeled mission degradation scenarios, so that way we can offer the best glimpse of what a future state likely is in the event a situation happens. And that's where that is very important to do. Modeling that mission degradation is something that is intensive in terms of an investment. It's typically involved and requires a number of stakeholders to produce. But if you're able to prevent that kind of degradation from occurring, it pays unbelievable dividends, right, in terms of your return on investment of recouping from there. Also having clear traceability from the intelligence feeds that you have building into your assumptions and outputs that you are able to construct, particularly when we think about risk modeling here. And this is really, I would say, the ingredients for success, if you will, of how you defend decisions before the incident happens. Now, in the commercial world, a little bit differently, but I would also add the ability to have a clear return on investment. Different risks and assets these events occur. And that's revenue, that's reputation, surely people as well, right? We have all of these considerations that exist, and the same is not completely different for our cyber, but priorities tend to be a bit different. And so I'd say, again, understanding what your mission goals and objectives are really paramount here in order to be able to facilitate that business case, or mission case rather, in this instance, of being able to have a good discussion with leadership to get their buy-in. So in the next slide, I want to introduce something that may be familiar to all of you already, depending on your cyber fluency. And I'm not going to do justice of really doing a deep dive into FAIR, but I want to expose you to the factor analysis of information risk model. And this is a framework that's really helpful when we start thinking about just how to actually model risk and really think about how to best take actions. This is something we spend a lot of time on across our program of study within Carnegie Mellon University for a lot of the AI and cyber degrees and programs that we offer. And interestingly enough, a lot of industry cyber groups also advocate for the use of FAIR. So it is not just an academic kind of model or framework, but is operational and very helpful when we think about, how often and how much does it matter for us to be able to be concerned with our quantitative risk models. And that's really that piece there of where FAIR becomes most valuable. One of the kind of punchlines that I would say is very important here as well is that FAIR sets out this kind of risk equation for us. Very basic equation, but one that's worth keeping in mind, that risk equals our loss event frequency multiplied by the loss magnitude. And that's one way that we can really think about having more of a basic example of how often a threat successfully causes loss. That's our loss event frequency, and multiplying that by the impact if such a loss occurs, or our loss magnitude. Here for our cyber, I would say FAIR would really do a great job of aligning cyber risk with commander decision making, not just compliance checklists. And I know that's sometimes a piece that we get bogged down on in different areas of cyber. But again, tracing that back to focusing on real-time decision making versus just another compliance checklist is not what we're in the business of trying to do here. And so when we think about some of the relevance, aligning our cyber risk with overall mission impact, making sure that we're able to support commander trade-offs, because we typically have those trade-offs that are going to take place whenever we have to make the more important decisions. And again, having that traceability that we want to have from the threat intelligence to the modeled risk, and then making those decisions of if we want to accept, mitigate, transfer, or avoid altogether the risk that we are being presented with. So quick, very, I think that was maybe a 2 or 3 minute elevator pitch of the FAIR model, and we could spend the entire hour together just dissecting that a little bit more. But just want to introduce this concept to everybody so that way you can have some insight into the deeper parts of our conversation here. On the next slide, we kind of begin the next part of our discussion of translating threat intelligence into different risk scenarios. So threat intelligence becomes actionable only when it's embedded into our scenarios. And these are going to be unique to the organizations. I don't mean to be a broken record, but again, we really have to take account for the organization or the enterprise's mission and goals if we're going to do this well. We can't just make up generic scenarios that aren't going to be very helpful to us. We want to make sure that we're focusing on plausible scenarios that align well with the organization that we're trying to serve. So some ingredients for success, if you will, a good scenario, if you're looking at developing these, is going to include a real threat actor, and it could be a threat actor group, a plausible attack path to your system or your application or platform, definitely mission relevant impact that we would want to be cognizant of, that we can measure and kind of assess. And, I would say another, tenet too of a good scenario would be focusing on duration and recovery assumptions, particularly if you are still new at measuring that kind of benchmark. Without these scenarios and without these tenets under the scenarios, intelligence stays abstract. And quite honestly, it's not helpful. This is the state most organizations are in. They're inundated with all of these threat intelligence feeds, but they don't take action with them. So why would you even bother making that kind of investment of collecting them, potentially paying for them, and having teams look at them if you're not going to take action off of them? And that's an important part that we continue to see most organizations struggle with. One thing here, consider this our cyber example at the bottom of the slide, where we have threat reporting identifying malware, specifically designed to target mission command software during joint operations. Again, this could be an example that might resonate with some of you, given the current state. Some of those elements that I just mentioned, or ingredients for success, if you will, would again be our threat actor and their capability, potentially the attack window aligned to the exercises or conflict onset, so we have a good idea of when we can anticipate. Looking at those affected systems that we might have in operational units. And that also conveys a lot of insight for us typically of how to make future state investments. What I mean by that, when we think about affected systems, this is particularly an area of interest for topics like federated learning. When we jump into kind of more forward-leaning configurations and architectures that are reflective of distributed AI, this is very important back to this situation of a joint operation. We could be talking about joint services from the United States or potentially joint operations with allied partners. And so when we have those kinds of situations, it also opens up additional considerations we might want to take, where a federated learning model would not only provide us with more real-time data coming out of our model or algorithm outputs, but also give us the ability to facilitate greater privacy between our data feeds. And that might be necessary if we're thinking about geographic discrepancies that might exist, or if we're operating in a multi-security class environment where we might have TS, secret, CUI, other kind of fields, and I'm sorry, other kind of levels that are kind of fusing data together, and we're thinking about those kinds of implications and how best to secure them. Also kind of think about redundancy, which we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, and what that could really look like as a strategic imperative that we might want to employ in our organization. The final piece here, again, definitely resonates with our theater of operations throughout the world when we consider degraded command and control outcomes. This becomes increasingly important as we think about, Skyborg transitioning from a Vanguard program to a program of record, and this idea of us being able to have collaborative combat aircraft, which we continue to see, lead the way of having crewed and uncrewed aircraft among other vessels that are able to collaborate and being able to deliver, lethality when we think about the different missions that they can take, and just the importance of those systems overall, as we can all imagine different kind of scenarios and outcomes that could take place if an adversary was able to get a hold of those systems. So as we kind of continue this idea on the next slide, what are some of the quantitative adjustments to risk models we might want to take? All right, so again, let's focus more on the application here, take more of a pragmatic spin. Threat intelligence should drive our parameter changes, not prettier dashboards, right? That's very easy to do, especially those of us that might live in the Tableau or Power BI, kind of very data visualization environments. Having good threat intelligence should really drive our parameter changes and not just give us something that's pretty to share. Some of these model adjustments, could include higher event frequency based off the intel feed that we have, expanding our impact ranges, reducing control effectiveness, anticipating longer recovery times, and things like that. Criticality. Not all assets change equally, and that's something that we should be cognizant of as well. And this will help us to kind of keep that idea that adjustments must always be traceable back to specific intelligence inputs, right? We don't want to be changing our parameters haphazardly or in a lackluster fashion. We want to make sure that we're able to do so and have that traceability back for a number of reasons. Continuity of, human capital, making sure that we're able to reevaluate if we learn that newer intelligence has replaced or amended intel that we had previously. And so all of this kind of leads us to the next slide, where we really focus on our forecasting and decision support. And you even get a cheesy, Doc Rock little image at the bottom of this that we'll dissect just very briefly. But when we think about forecasting and decision support, well-integrated CTI allows organizations to move from more of the reactive to the predictive risk management. And that allows us to have better response to different situations, better insight. We have budget prioritization. We typically can calculate better return on investment analysis for controls, and also get at greater continuity around our risk acceptance decisions, and ultimately prepare us for better operational readiness planning. So threat intelligence, really, this is where we can start to see it helping us become forward-looking, not just as some report that's going to collect dust on a desk, but on where we anticipate going, right? Because if we just focus on where we've been, what's already happened, that only gets us so far. And so the key takeaway here is that threat intelligence does allow us to have that forward look. And the graphic at the bottom just exists for us to really think about a maturity model of sorts is one way you could think about it. On the left, we have this raw data that's disconnected, doesn't really have any kind of themes from it. And this is true in a lot of ways as we start thinking about machine learning operations in general and just kind of data mature organizations. From there, we kind of move into information where we're starting to glean maybe themes out of the data sets that we have to knowledge, where we're connecting dots and we're starting to understand relationships potentially and how that's going to anticipate changes to our risk model and how we think about situations. And from there, I would say that knowledge to insight is really the proactive stance if we do that effectively. When we start to glean insight of different situations, it really helps us to, in terms of the courses of action, the COAs we might want to take, and the overall decisions that we're going to need to make in terms of our organization, our enterprise, and in particular, making sure that we prioritize the safety of our assets, whatever those assets may be for a given organization. So you might be wondering right now, all right, I've been listening to you talk for about a half an hour on this. How do I approach this? I might be starting from a blank sheet of paper in my organization if I'm in more of a data-centric kind of immature organization, or just kind of absence of cyber, whether this is kind of a maturity issue or a turnaround setting, or some kind of situation where we don't have the existing infrastructure and expertise. And so on the next slide, we can kind of have that conversation here when we think about some of the different risk modeling frameworks and methodologies that exist. Now, I am not, pushing just favorites here. I tried to be thoughtful in which methodologies to introduce in terms of our cyber, but it is important to kind of recognize there are many methodologies out there. In addition to FAIR, other methodologies that we'll kind of hit on here, Monte Carlo analysis, Bayesian approaches, we'll highlight that a little bit, attack trees, and other kinds of kill chain modeling that exist as well that can be really helpful when we're trying to understand how this threat intelligence can become relevant for us and really calculate our risk. One thing to kind of keep in mind here that's worth mentioning, these frameworks and methodologies are starting points. They're not solutions. And that's kind of another lesson learned that I would offer up here, is that many times organizations want to apply a framework or methodology in full without that unique tailoring that, again, this broken record is going to chime in on, without taking into consideration the priorities, the objectives, the mission of your organization. So again, when you think about these things, whether we're talking about FAIR or MITRE ATT&CK or Monte Carlo analysis you might want to employ, really focus on organizational and enterprise unique tenets that are very important when we do the threat modeling, when we bring those kinds of scenarios and develop those situations. The real question I would say here is, where does uncertainty matter most for your organization? How do you handle things like bias? This is another buzzword right now in AI, right? Responsible and secure and trustworthy AI, and we want our AI systems to be free from bias. That's utter ludicrous, right? There is no such thing as a piece of software or technology that a human being touches being bias free. And any industry partner or any organization that's telling you that is lying. We know that bias will exist. So we want to do our due diligence to really understand, how can we kind of measure that? How do we handle it? How do we respond to it? And surely, are there approaches we can take to mitigate the amount of bias that we might have? And then finally, I'd say another real question to really consider here is really, are the outputs decision relevant for your organization? So, these are just some considerations that I would offer up as we think about employing these kinds of risk modeling frameworks and methodologies for sure. On the next slide, kind of jump into this idea of threat intelligence and risk tooling. I thought it was relevant just to share a couple examples. I promise you, I don't get any kind of kickback from any of these platforms whatsoever. These are just kind of some of the best of breed. If you want more insight, Gartner does a great job with their Magic Quadrant, of talking about some of these different tools. This is just to kind of help build that vernacular. Tools do matter. I think they are important, but keep in mind, again, like frameworks, they don't replace judgment. So whether we're looking at things like threat intelligence platforms or tips, other vulnerability tools, control testing, quantitative platforms or dashboards, all of these are enablers. They're not solutions in of themselves. And I think oftentimes that gets confused, not just in terms of cyber. The value, here, again, our main takeaway only emerges when intelligence, exposure, controls, and modeling are intentionally connected to our mission outcomes. So I really hope that point has kind of been hammered home at this stage. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of these different kind of tools that exist, but here's a list, to offer to all of you if you're thinking about some of the different areas and different approaches you might want to become familiar with. I do want to continue our conversation on the next slide, just to kind of hit on organization and cultural enablers, because this is, very important. Um, I will share my experience in terms of cybersecurity, particularly in the national security space. This is the hardest part. You can engineer and you can develop unbelievably great solutions. And yes, there might be challenges when you think about things like data fusion and developing infrastructure and getting buy-in for budget. I'm not discounting any of those challenges, but if you don't have good governance and user adoption, other organizational change management kind of tenets, you're not going to get anywhere. And this is where it is so important, I would argue, to take more of that AI engineering approach to your systems, particularly in this day and age, since we can't really talk about cyber without AI, of making sure we're doing our due diligence to focus on things like repeatability and taking a disciplined approach to ensure that we're able to replicate and sustain as well as scale the solutions that we might employ. So punchline here is that this is not a technology problem. When we trace this back to risk modeling, the maturity of our risk modeling really depends on our ability to have cross-functional collaboration. Again, bring those stakeholders together. Who are the subject matter experts that might exist for the mission? And how can we make sure there's a common vernacular for them to be able to engage and collaborate with your cyber warriors, as well as with leadership and other stakeholders that really matter within your mission organization? It's also important that, kind of racy matrix, all the project managers, program managers here, 101, are able to kind of disseminate clear ownership and accountability. Because if we don't have that, it tends to be very difficult to kind of manage good risk modeling. I mentioned kind of this idea of a common risk language, and this is important. That language is very important. Um, just as I probably, if I were to ask all of you in this virtual room right now to define artificial intelligence, I would probably get a myriad of different definitions with a fair amount of overlap, hopefully in some areas. But it's important that we take these concepts and have a Rosetta Stone, if you will. That's where tools like enterprise architecture are important. Please don't throw tomatoes at me for those of you that have had to create DODAF artifacts. I'm not necessarily going that far, but just having this kind of common vernacular that we can have stakeholders together and understand what it means to have a cyber threat. And what does that look like? And how we can have consistency across some of these inputs that we just talked about in the qualitative and quantitative spheres to be able to have good regular intelligence to risk review cycles that different stakeholders can participate in. Again, I kind of mentioned this, but the biggest barrier is typically organizational, not technical. I can say surely from my experience that has been very true. And kind of on that note, on the next slide, just kind of introduce some key takeaways here in terms of lessons learned. And this is more from some of the mission partners that we've served as a university, as well as some other different studies and research that we've engaged in. Yeah, I'd say we can kind of close out our discussion today, this afternoon, with a core message that threat intelligence does have very limited value unless it changes modeled risk. Again, $1 million paperweight or whatever you spend for that threat intelligence doesn't matter if it doesn't have an impact on your modeled risk. Further, if you don't model risk, you're even further behind the curve, and it's important to start thinking about how to approach that for your organization. At the same time, too, we're not looking for perfection. So I think a good goal to set is this idea of better decisions under certainty, not perfect prediction. That's what we want to aim for when we look at translating cyber threat intelligence into good risk modeling. If intelligence cannot be mapped to a defined scenario, it should not change the model, right? We don't want to haphazardly or lackluster approaches to our model in any way, shape, or form. I'd say the final test is always our ability to have decision utility. So when we think about that, it's not about all the analysis paralysis and other things we might think about. That decision utility should allow us to answer questions like, should we prioritize this system now or this platform now? What are the risks that we accept if we delay taking this kind of action? And another good kind of test question you can ask yourself, how does this compare to other mission risks that you have? Because odds are, particularly when we think about national security, there are going to be many competing risks that exist for our mission. And it's very, very seldom that we're going to encounter just a couple. So we need to have that wider brushstroke to really understand what is the comparative nature of these different risk scenarios and situations that we might be engaging in. And so with that, on the next slide, I'll just offer kind of a shameless plug for those of you that might be interested in kind of furthering the discussion in this space, as well as the future of secure AI. We do have an upcoming micro-credential, an executive certificate, excuse me, here at CMU that we're going to offer the first week in March. Which is going to allow mid-senior level leaders to be able to have a chance to interact with CMU faculty, industry expertise, in talking about things like this. And being able to come to campus and participate. So there's some information there for anybody that's interested in taking more of a futures view of how we can secure AI and understand that intersection of cybersecurity and artificial intelligence for much time to come. So I wanted to try to stay honest and true to ending a little bit early. And I think we have about 12 minutes or so. So I'm happy to kind of go through questions that folks may have across the area here. I'll just kind of pull up the chat as best I can here. Let's see. We got some AI assistants. We see that. I think that's true, Amanda, that we'll make the recording available to everyone. That question popped up. Oh, yes, and we answered that. Sorry. All right, another AI assistant. Why does FAIR need um, I don't what inputs does FAIR need to operate and provide good results? So good question there. When we think about that kind of modeling, I would say, again, having that balance that we can strike between good quantitative and qualitative inputs are very important when we think about that model. And there's a number of kind of different, focuses when we think about FAIR and that equation, very basic equation that I mentioned that accounts for loss event frequency as well as loss magnitude, right? Being able to calculate a risk. We want to make sure that we're able to feed kind of both those sides, and not to get too geeky math lead on you, but that's ultimately what's going to give us a good model. If we're able to understand what that risk is, we need to be able to derive it from our loss event frequency as well as our loss magnitude. And so that allows us to kind of dive further into vulnerabilities. When we think about loss event frequency, we need to have better accounting and inventory of our vulnerabilities that exist. When we think about loss magnitude, kind of dissecting that further, we want to be able to have better primary loss, secondary risk. Those are other kind of attributes too that we need to have for areas for us to be able to do a good job. Kind of building on FAIR, are you seeing any adoption with PEOs using it to develop risks for program protection plans? I will say it's been limited in terms of PEOs. My view anyway is that industry organizations have been doing a lot more with FAIR in terms of that area. So PEOs, I think absolutely should. That's an area that I think would be very helpful. That's the right level of the organization, I think, to be able to employing this. And maybe it is taking place. I'm just not as familiar with where that is right now in 2026. I would hope for sure. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to collaborate. So if you do have thoughts, I think Jacob, you asked that, happy to kind of engage further if there are ways that we can kind of support that adoption, even if it's through just some voluntary advising here from the university. Thank you for adding questions. Just trying to see, have you ever heard of the government patented tool CVEST? I have heard of it. I've never used it. So I don't have much familiarity outside of kind of the elevator punchline there. And then it looks like we have a couple more, just trying to cover. Let's see. I'm curious why we left SIEM SOAR out of the recommended tool sets, since much of the decision-making logic seems to have a suitable landing place with those platforms. Vulnerability scans are great to identify maintenance tasks for network hardening, but SIEM top threat alerts give us absolutely. It was kind of just a prioritization based off the constraint of the presentation. but SEAM, SOAR would be something I would love to dove into here, just in terms of prioritization that ended up getting cut. It's something we talk a lot about in my cyber risk modeling course that I teach at CMU, and it's definitely an area that I would recommend that we look at again. The information contained here was consolidated and definitely abridged. So there's a lot more other of these areas that we can really dive into, particularly where frameworks and tools are concerned, for sure. How do you recommend organizations balance the analysis paralysis scenarios with moving too fast and making bad arbitrary decisions? Good question. I would say there a really important consideration is just making sure that as you consider what you're developing, you're taking a disciplined approach. Having that traceability, really enforcing that idea of understanding how inputs and parameters may change and being able to trace it back to the intel that's feeding those. When you look at all of the different threat feeds coming in, it is very difficult to consider which ones are most relevant to your organization many times. So I would say having the ability, particularly now, to employ some of the automation technologies that exist. And that's where it's going to be important to understand what are your organizational priorities. So I would say one of the common things that I hear that scares the hell out of me is when anybody in leadership across the Department of War says, we want to be like Netflix. That signals to me a pretty clear absence of understanding of these technologies. That's not to say that we don't want to be able to be as fast and we don't want to be as agile or whatever buzzword bingo you want to use here. But the importance is understanding your organizational priorities. And we know for certain that our national security priorities are much different than a streaming platform that's offering entertainment to individuals. And so it's important for us to really have those inventory, those priorities accounted for before we start looking at the threat intelligence feeds, before we start thinking about how best to incorporate kind of those changes. All right, I think I got all the questions, Amanda, out of the chat, I believe. Forgive me if I missed any.
There was one way up at the top about distroing the slides. I will leave that up to you if you would be okay with us adding those slides onto our website when we post the recording. Totally up to you, sir.
Absolutely. I'm fine with a distro A, distribution here, so no worries on my side.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to post one thing in the chat. So just some information from CFIC to everyone who is still engaged. I did mention at the beginning, but I know there were still a lot of people that were coming in. So this is a webinar series that CFIC hosts 4 times a year. I put those dates in the chat for the ones that are upcoming. And again, we will send out an email to everyone who registered so they'll be able to get to our webpage where we'll have the recording posted along with the slides. And I just wanted to mention to everyone, if there's a topic that seems very relevant, either in your experience working with the Department of War in some capacity, or your experience as a company, an individual, an organization, what have you, those topic suggestions or speakers are always welcome. So I did put my email address in the chat. You can feel free to email me, and I will keep that in my notes for upcoming webinars. Any other questions before we do our thanks and wrap up?
I just want to thank everybody today for allowing us to kind of share some of this information and meet with all of you. I just offer, if there's anything that we can do to continue to support the mission, please feel free to reach out. Happy to, even if it's not me, but connect you with the right resources at CMU, across the university. We love our mission partners and love to work with all of you. So anything we can do to help the mission, we're here.
And for those couple of people who were mentioning CVAST, I will gather your information from your registration and pass that along to Dr. Mattarock.
Yeah, happy to have that conversation. That'd be great.
Yeah. All right, so it looks like we've got a couple of minutes left, but I really appreciate everyone hopping on, asking questions, engaging, and this is some information that I believe is going to be helpful for no matter what type of organization you have. I'm definitely a firm believer in having a plan and seeing that through. I appreciated some of the sketches on that one slide. It looks like some things that I may have scribbled in my notebook at my desk. But again, thank you, Dr. Mattarock, for taking your time today and for everyone being able to attend. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.
Thank you very much, everyone.